You ever wonder what it would be like if you were living in Harlem in the 1980s as a black person? Well, for the lives of the 5 or 6 kids that we're about to see, it was kind of like this. This is Tron, and he's got a pretty decent life, and that's his dad, Bobby. And this is Kevin, and his sister Angie. And this one is Corey, and that's his girlfriend. And this one is Raymond. And last but not least, we have Yusuf. And if you're wondering where all these teens are really excited to go, they're just excited to go to the park. It's this thing that they do on Saturdays. They go to the park, they wild out, and they have a little bit of fun. And all the boys I told you about saw the rally and all the other teenage boys going to the park, and they're now amongst the other boys. And after they got to the park and everybody was doing their thing, Kevin and Yusuf witnessed somebody getting beat up. This white kid being beat up by a bunch of black kids. And right then and there, they hear sirens, cops raid the park, everybody starts running away, and a bunch of the guys and so many other black teens get arrested. And here we see one of the cops catching Kevin and hitting him over the head with his helmet. Putting this aside for a second, on that same night, a jogger, a woman, was raped in the same park a couple miles away from where the boys were. And this is Officer Linda. She's here to investigate what happened to the lady. And as she was going through the initial report, she sees that there was another incident in the same park where a bunch of black teenagers were taken into custody. She goes into the room where they were being held, and the detectives tell her that they're going to go to family court. She gets incredibly agitated when she hears this because she now thinks that all these boys are now witnesses to what happened to that lady that very same night. At this point, Raymond's parents and Kevin's mom were at the police station asking where their children are. And Antron, who made it back home, gets a visit from a few detectives who make him dress in the same clothes that he was wearing the night before, and they also make him and his parents go to the police station as well. And at this point, news has broken out about the lady and what happened at the park, and Linda has studied the patterns and has gathered a lot of information and has concluded that the boys are not actually witnesses, they're actually suspects. And now that the police think that they're all suspects, the police start picking up all the boys who were at the park the night before. And this includes Yusuf, who also happens to be on the list. The police catch up to him and they take him down to the station, and since Corey was his best buddy and he didn't really want to let him go to the police station by himself, and since the cops insisted, hey, you want to go with your buddy, you'll be back within a few hours, he's like, yeah, sure, I'll go there. And at the police station, Linda has instructed all the detectives to start treating these kids as adults since they committed a brutal act of rape on a woman. She tells the detectives to have the kids name the accomplices and to confess to the crime. And the interrogation starts with Kevin. Kevin, who's only 14 and should not legally be questioned unless supervised by a parent, starts to get harassed by a bunch of cops who are now wailing on him because his mother went back home to get some medication. And as Kevin was being questioned alone, which is very illegal, Antron had his parents present and he was also being questioned. And so was Raymond, who had his grandmother with him. But Yusuf, just like Kevin, didn't really have anyone and he was being questioned alone. And after a little while into the questioning, the cops start telling each of the boys that the other boys saw them raping the lady. And these boys don't even know each other. Kevin doesn't know Raymond, Raymond doesn't know Corey, but they tell each and every one of them that the other one said that they saw them rape the lady in the park. And all the boys start to get confused and they start to deny the story because it didn't really happen. And when they start denying it, the police start to get very violent, they start to push them around, they start to scream at them. It gets very ugly. And it even gets uglier as the cops change tactics and they make them turn on each other. One of the cops convinces Raymond that Kevin did it. He shows him a photo of Kevin and of the scar that was left after the cop hit him on the face in the park last night. And he tells him that it was him that did the rape and pointed his finger at Raymond. And the cops do this to all the boys. They try to make them say a story that just didn't happen. And this actually works with some of the boys. And with Antron, one of the cops tells his father it's either he says that the story happened or we're gonna lock him up. So Antron's father, Bobby, convinces his son to lie. And when Raymond's father gets to the station, Raymond tells his father that he's cut a deal and that he'd agree to everything that the police said. And Kevin also gives in after a bunch of harassments and he admits to something that didn't happen. And when his sister gets there, she signs his confession because he was too underage to sign it. But Yusuf's mother makes it to the station and she threatens to call the New York Times, and then Linda lets her see her son and she takes her son home. And at this point, Linda was trying to gather all the evidence to make it fit the facts that she fabricated. She has no evidence of the fact that these boys raped the girl, nor does she have any motive or proof or anything really. So she goes to the DA, a woman named Elizabeth, and she tells her what she has on hand now. And Elizabeth tells her that this is a very weak case and she needs to find more evidence, otherwise nobody's gonna charge them. And at this point, most of the boys have some kind of legal guardian or something, except for Corey. If you remember, Corey only went to the station because his friend Yusuf went there and he didn't want to leave him alone. But the police beat Corey up and make him confess to something he didn't see and something he didn't do. The police make most of the boys confess to a story that didn't happen and they videotape them. And after they got their coerced and fake confession, they put them all in one room and the 4 boys, Yusuf, Kevin, Antron, and Raymond, meet for the first time. They talk a little bit and then they all apologize to one another because they all blamed the other one for something that they didn't see happen. And on episode 2, we learned that now it's been 6 months since the boys have been arrested. And they've been in and out of family courts and only Yusuf has made bail so far. And we also learned that in the 6 months, a lot of people have made movements for and against the boys. One of the interesting steps that was taken was by Donald Trump, who suggested to bring back the death penalty and kill who's ever in charge of the rape. And now that since all the boys are about to go to trial, Elizabeth, the DA, starts vetting their different lawyers. And the lawyers that the families picked to represent the boys are not really that impressive. There's a divorce lawyer who's never practiced criminal law, and another guy who's just an activist working pro bono, and another guy who used to be a cop but just has political aspirations and that's why he joined the case. And last but not least, there is this one guy who's an actual criminal lawyer. So with a bunch of these lawyers combined, the families come together and they try to form a case. And when the DA lawyer Elizabeth hears the tapes that the police made of the boys confessing, she realizes that she can't use the tapes in the trial because the boys never implicate themselves in the crime, they implicate each other. And because of this, the DA decides to separate the trials. This way, the DA can just edit the tapes to a point where they can just implicate all of the boys one by one. Linda and the DA have also withheld evidence. Apparently, there was a sock with semen inside of it found in the park, and they plan to test it during the trials and surprise everyone on the other side. And as the trial and news of the rape start to intensify, Antron's father starts to feel incredibly guilty about what he made his son do. And because of that guilt, he just doesn't come home anymore. And during the day of the trial, the DA and the boys' lawyers start going back and forth. The DA starts by making the case that Kevin Richardson grabbed the jogger and then Yusuf Salam hit her over the head with a pipe. And the boys' respective lawyers try to convince the jury that that didn't take place and there is no physical evidence of that happening. And the DA responds to this by saying that there are videotapes, recordings of the boys admitting to all of this. But the boys' lawyers respond by saying that all of the confession that was taken was coerced. And day after day, this kept happening. The DA presented shocking images of the victim and how she was brutally injured and raped. They presented a witness who was in the park that said that the boys were acting like gangsters. And the boys' lawyers present a witness of their own, a man who was attacked in the park by a bunch of black teens. And when asked if one of the attackers was in the courtroom, the man said no. And at this point, the DA Elizabeth runs into a little bit of a moral dilemma. Even the evidence that they hid from the boys, the sock that was found in the park, does not match any of their DNAs. And she starts to wonder, are we trying to jail people who didn't commit any crime whatsoever? And when she goes to Linda with this, Linda convinces her that they are part of this. And what the police and Linda did was just try to make the stories fit together because the boys did have something to do with the rape. And so, Elizabeth gets convinced enough to not have anything on her conscience. And with that, she calls Patricia, the victim, on the stand. Patricia sustained a lot of wounds, she can barely walk, but when asked if she remembers anything about what happened, she doesn't recall anything whatsoever. And a day later, the boys' lawyers put the cops that did most of the interrogation on the stand. And most of the cops have great stories, but none of the stories come together. One cop says that he saw one of the boys cry, another one says he didn't see it. Because everything was fabricated, they could not get their facts straight. And when the boys' lawyers put the doctor that did all the DNA analysis on the stand, He tells them that he ran a DNA test to a sock that was found in the park that contained semen. And when asked if the DNA matched any of the boys' DNAs, he said no. And now, the prosecution, seeing that their case is slowly falling apart because they have almost no physical evidence, the prosecutor decides to offer a deal. But after discussing it a bit, all the boys and their lawyers and their families decide they're not going to admit to something that they didn't do. So they decide to keep fighting in court, and the prosecution calls Antron's father to the stand. And Bobby, Antron's father, tells the jury that the police made him coerce his son into admitting to a crime. But that doesn't sway the jury much because the prosecutor, Elizabeth, tells them that she has Antron's confession on tape. And not only did the police have Antron's confession, they have all of the boys confessing to the rape. And after showing the video to the jury of all the boys confessing to the rape, the prosecution calls Corey Wise to the stand. Corey tells the jury that one police officer took him to a maintenance room and beat him up repeatedly because he wanted him to say that he was at the rape. And after Corey's defense lawyer, when the prosecutor took the stand, and when Corey is asked to read a statement that he signed, he refuses, furiously. He refuses, saying that he didn't write that and saying that he can't really read well. And after a lot of back and forth and a lot of drama, the jury finally reaches a verdict. And the jury finds all the boys guilty of all charges. And while the rest of the boys went to juvie, Corey, because he was 16, went to an actual prison with adults. And now we see the individual lives of all the boys after they leave prison. Antron finally gets released years later. He goes back home and can't stand the look of his own father because he left his mom after Antron went to prison. She told him that he left but came back because he was incredibly sick and his kidneys were failing. Antron is very angry by the fact that his mother took back his father. And Raymond Santana only kept contact with his father on the phone. And Raymond, just like all the other boys, grew up in juvie, and finally, after he became a man, years later, he got released. And he goes back to the neighborhood to see that it's changed so much. His father introduces him to his new wife, who seems to not like Raymond at all. And when he gets home, he finds that there are so many kids and people he just doesn't know. Raymond has been away from his house and from his neighborhood for so long that things have changed drastically. And as Raymond and Antron were trying to adjust to life on the outside, Corey and Yusuf were still on the inside. Corey's mother tracks down Yusuf's mother and she asks her if Yusuf can maybe write to Corey, because Corey only went down to the station with him that day because he didn't want to leave his friend alone in a police station. But Yusuf's mother tells her that Yusuf can't really write to Corey. As they're now both convicted felons, they can't write to each other from one prison to the next. And Yusuf got regular visits from his mother. She encouraged him to study his religion in prison and to stay safe. What she didn't tell him was the fact that she lost a lot of jobs because everybody thought that she was the mother of the man who raped a woman in the park. And after years in prison, Yusuf also got released. And so did Kevin, who was in the same prison as Yusuf. At this point, all of them are out except for Corey, and they're trying to grow accustomed to a life outside of prison. And this proves especially hard for Raymond Santana. He sees that the outside life is very difficult and that nobody really wants to hire an ex-con. And things start to get a lot more difficult at home because his stepmother really doesn't like him. And it's not only Raymond that's facing a few problems. All the boys learn that on the outside, if you're an ex-con, things are really not that easy. They also see that dating is not really that easy. Raymond tries to get it on with this girl who used to write to him while he was still on the inside, and Antron starts dating somebody from work, but he sees that people don't really see you the same after you get convicted. And since none of them had real good money, this also becomes a problem. Antron's girlfriend breaks up with him, saying that he's not really taking her out on real dates, and Raymond's girl leaves after his stepmother finds them in his room. And just to keep her in his life, he tries to do everything he could to get as much money as possible. And since he didn't really have his own place and she wanted to move in together, he starts dealing drugs just to afford it. And a couple months go by, Antron's father passes away, and he moves to another state, starts this other job. And while they were both seeing their parole officer, Kevin and Yusuf bump into each other. Yusuf tells Kevin that he's married now, and that he's trying to move on with his life. And as the rest of the guys were trying to make do with what they had, Raymond was selling as much drugs as he could just to make that money. And as he finally made enough money to move out, the police finally catch up to him and he goes back to jail again. And Corey, the only one from the group that got sent to prison and not juvie, first went to Rikers Island, 7 miles away from Harlem. And at Rikers, the violence and the hate proved too much for Corey. He witnesses animosity and violence that he's never witnessed before. For the first time in his life, everyone around him starts treating him as an adult. And because of the corruption and the racism, Corey gets incredibly physically abused and hated. And because things were going very badly at Rikers, Corey asks for a transfer. And in about a year, just when he thought that he'd be closer to Harlem, he gets transferred to Attica, 352 miles away from Harlem. And in Attica, the Nazi inmates, who now think that he's a black teen who raped a white woman, start beating the crap out of him. And in Attica, there was really no task that he could perform because somebody would beat him up. And seeing that he doesn't really get along with anyone, a guard by the name of Roberts takes pity on him and then he puts him in solitary confinement. And from the fear and loneliness, Corey starts to lose track of time. He starts to hallucinate in his cell about his brother. And after a lot of time in solitary, Corey gets a phone call. And he goes to see that the phone call was about his brother being murdered back in Harlem. And the pain and hardship for Corey only start to get worse as he couldn't leave solitary confinement in fear of physical danger. And he couldn't just stay in there as the prison forgot to pay for the AC unit. And so, for many days and months, he suffered the heat wave without any air conditioning. But at least in solitary, Roberts was very nice to him and he gave him magazines and food and became a companion that Corey can confide in. But that didn't really matter much as Corey had a lot of time to do, and every time during his parole hearing, the parole board asks him to admit to the crime that he got convicted for. And every time, Corey said no, cause he didn't really rape that lady. And as the days, weeks, and months passed by, Corey started to get really lonely, and he missed his mother as she was the only family that he had. And thinking that all his bad luck has now been used up, Corey applied to be transferred again to another prison, thinking that he'll be closer to Harlem this time. But the state transfers him even further to Wendy State Penitentiary, now 366 miles from Harlem. And in Wendy, he didn't really have Roberts to protect him from the gangs and from the people that hated him, so he got beat up so bad that he ended up in the emergency room. And now in Wendy, he sees that the only option he has is to stay in solitary as well. And so, for many months, he stays alone in solitary confinement. And after a lot of months of solitary confinement, Corey decides he doesn't really want parole anymore. He wants to max out his trial and leave then. And at around 2001, after 9/11, Corey meets a man by the name of Mateus Reyes. He had a fight with this guy back in another prison. And when Corey thinks that this is another guy who wants to beat him up again, he just apologizes and walks away. But the thing about Mateus Reyes is, apparently, he's a serial rapist, and he's the one that raped that lady in the park. And since he was facing life in prison for all the rapes that he committed, he figures, why would I let somebody else do my time? And he confesses to the rape. And after all these years, Linda and the rest of the detectives, when faced with the hard facts now, didn't even decide to apologize or admit that they were wrong. Linda was too busy writing crime novels, and the detectives were too busy getting drunk in random bars. But the police that actually took Reyes' statement actually proved that he's the one that did it, and they vindicated the rest of the boys. And finally, after all his pain and his hardships, Corey gets released from prison, and everybody else, including Raymond, get vindicated. And New York City, after a lot of courtrooms, awards the boys $44 million in restitution. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how the series comes to an end.